Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express-News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
City Hall reporter Joshua Fechter,
reporter Brian Chasnoff.
And we're into the third week of January 2020. As we record this, the MLK March is, I think, underway here in San Antonio. I think the biggest march in the country. And as we're doing this, I think three big issues that San Antonio is dealing with are sort of all converged. And they were all, I think they converged in one letter from State Representative Lyle Larson to Mayor Ron Nirenberg. And Josh, you and our education reporter Krista Turalva wrote about this last week. What did Lyle Larson have to say? He wasn't wishing the mayor a happy new year, I don't think.
No, I don't think he was. He was saying, however, that the mayor's initiative to basically take or reroute funds that currently go towards the Edwards Aquifer Protection Program to instead fund public transit. He basically said just totally nix that. Mm-hmm. And if you really want to go get more funds for public transit, why don't you go get it out of PreK for SA? That was sort of Representative Larson's whole spiel there. And it's interesting because you've got the aquifer protection tax is already, set to expire in November. You're putting it before the voters to say, hey, redirect this money to instead fund public transit. And you've got PreK for SA that's up for renewal this year as well.
That's right. It's all these things are happening at the same time. And basically the mayor's plan has been, because, those who know about the history of transportation funding in San Antonio know that in 1977, when the Mass Transit Authority was created in San Antonio, it was underfunded from the beginning. It's been talked about quite a bit, the fact that it was funded with a half-cent sales tax. Other cities, the big cities in Texas, subsequently went to a full cent. And so we've never really adequately funded this system. And we're at a point now where there's talk about trying to improve the bus system, maybe go to advanced rapid transit in the next several years. And so they're trying to find funding anywhere they can. Now, the aquifer protection and the linear parks taxes would add up to like 1.8 cents.
Yes.
And I think this the mayor's plan has been to have SAWS absorb the aquifer protection program. I guess the linear parks would probably be funded from other means, like maybe bond programs or something.
Yeah, they're still kind of working that out. And, he went before the SAWS board last week on which he sits. And the SAWS CEO, Robert Puente, said, we could take this on, but, our preliminary figures show that if we do it at this level, we could only basically fund about half of what the program's current funding is over a 5-year period.
Is that adequate considering that there's just fewer land that needs to be protected now?
Yeah, and that's something that the SAWS board is talking about, is kind of like, to what extent do we need to continue to actually do this? Is there sort of like an end point in sight, and do we actually need to fund?
What do the environmentalists say about this, the environmental community here?
They're, I spoke with Annalisa Peace, who's head of the, Greater Edwards Aquifer Alliance. I think I got that right.
That's right. That's right.
So, the environmental community here is, they think that if you don't fund it at the current levels, the thing's gonna, collapse on itself, and that we're gonna not have as much clean water, that the aquifer is gonna be endangered.
The argument that the opposing argument to that, which you tend to hear more in private, because I think, as you said, it's a popular program. And I think people are hesitant to come out in a way that makes them look like they're not sympathetic to environmental concerns. But the argument you might hear privately from some elected officials is, this program has been very successful. It's been in existence for about 20 years or so.
Yes.
And so you've already bought conservation easements over the recharge zone and contributing zones, covering so much. There's so much property, and you basically got this property locked in perpetuity. I mean, no one's going to be able to develop this property ever. And so the argument is that now we're at a point where we're having the taxpayers of this community pay landowners outside of Bexar County to not develop property that they probably hadn't planned on developing in rural areas.
I'd like to see someone present a worst case scenario for if SAWS takes over the program.
That's a great
what's
point.
the worst that could happen? Not to mention the fact that we're reducing our reliance on the Edwards Aquifer through these SAWS programs, right? The Vista Ridge pipeline, et cetera. So maybe it makes sense. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of...
It needs study, and that's I think that your point is a great one, that it really would demand, like, let's have some real study. How long do we need to have this program? To what degree? But nobody really wants to talk about it.
Well, there was a recent city study that came out that a bunch of people are citing that says, the aquifer, in terms of the amount of land that needs to be, conservation easements need to be bought, or, in other cases, this is a minority where land actually needs to be bought outright, is about 56,000 acres. So that's sort of the end in sight of this thing in terms of the actual conservation easements and the land acquisitions.
Nuremberg has such a record of being pro-environment. Seems like he ought to, has he chimed in on the risks of going with SAWS and relative to the benefits?
As far as I know, he doesn't seem to think that there are any sort of risks to them sort of taking on the program. He seems to think that they're sort of the proper home and the proper authority to take it over.
Was it your sense when Lyle Larson said, no, don't go to the Edwards Aquifer funding, don't use that to increase transportation funding? Was it your sense that he had concerns because SAWS is probably not going to fund this to the same degree, or did he? What was it clear what his concerns were about that? I
would say that his sort of concerns stemmed more out of the fact that he's natural resources chairman in the House.
He's definitely a big water aficionado.
But I mean, look,
expert.
like he took the opportunity to basically knock against an unpopular conservative target, which is PreK for SA. He pointed out that the ledge put in more than $700 million this past session to fund essentially PreK to school districts that want to offer it, even though he says that it's mandatory, but that's not true.
What happens to all these investments that the city's made in these physical locations if the program suddenly ceases to exist?
So if SAWS takes it over, let's say, or just in terms of it completely goes away.
PreK.
In terms of PreK?
Yeah.
So they haven't really, I don't think they've explored that at all. But he's just saying that, look, you've got this pot of money over here.
Yeah.
Go get it from there.
And this is the sort of odd alliances that form here. I don't know that the local environmental community would support doing away with PreK. I probably not. But they share Lyle Larson's concerns about messing with the Aquifer Protection Program. So that's kind of an unusual alliance. On the PreK issue, one of the things that, and when you and Krista Toralva wrote about this last week, I mean, one of the things that was pointed out is that Dr. Sarah Beret, the CEO of PreK for SA, she pushed back, as you said, on this issue that HB3, the school funding reform bill that the legislature passed this year, it definitely helped public school funding, including PreK, but she said it doesn't actually increase the pool of eligible kids. It just means that funding is available now to maybe go from, half day to full day.
Yeah. And they'll point out that, given the legislature's record on school finance, that money won't be there in the future.
It's not guaranteed. Yeah. I mean, they haven't really figured out long term where they're going to get the funding from. They sort of committed to doing this, and then they have to figure out in a couple of years, where's the funding going to come from.
I think another important thing to note is that Larson's suggestion is pretty much a non-starter, right? I mean, he also, I believe that he also said that they ought to just put it on the ballot as an either-or proposition.
Which is apparently, what I'm told, is illegal.
It's illegal. So I think, too bad he's not here. We could ask him where he came up with that idea.
We're hoping to have him on soon. But, the thing that's really interesting about PreK for SA, and we've seen this with a lot of programs, whenever a government entity tries to do something maybe that's new or outside the box, people are thinking, well, I'm going to be taxed more. How's this going to work? And then once they get used to it, they tend to become a little bit attached to it. It passed with just 53.6% of the vote in 2012. Last year, as we had the mayoral runoff, I thought, well, maybe we ought to talk about PreK for SA because it's going to come up for a vote in 2020. what do these people think about it? I knew Ron Nirenberg supported PreK for SA and was committed to it. I assumed that Greg Brockhouse was going to say, we shouldn't keep funding this thing. This is outside the scope of city government to be running a mini school district. And I was really surprised that he said, well, I was opposed to it, but then, I got a tour of it and of one of the centers, and it was impressive. And he took the attack, which is that I'm not going to try to stop it, but I think we just need to really monitor it closely, make sure we're not wasting any money. But it was that kind of thing.
Well, that's Brockhouse acknowledging that the program's popular, and that's the same problem that the Aquifer Protection Program is running into. And it should be noted that the PreK for SA board has asked, City Council and the mayor to move the renewal election to May and fast track it essentially, so they can secure an easier win and sort of avoid like a complicated ballot in November.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, because it passed, and as I said, it was close. It was a stressful election for Mayor Julian Castro, for whom this was his legacy program. But it did pass in November of 2012, which was the election in which Barack Obama got reelected, and it was a pretty good year for Democrats. Democrats are optimistic that they're going to have a good year in Bexar County in this November. But as you said, the thought is that let's move the election or have the election in May instead, because November is just a little dicey. I mean, how do you all feel about that? I mean, my guess is that it probably would have a good chance of passing either way. But what are the risks involved in having it in November?
Well, it seems like what they're sort of worried about is getting tangled up in. And somebody didn't turn their phone off.
It's on vibrate, and it's not mine, by the way. That's the host's phone.
I should probably put it up to the mic just to make it more obvious that I'm the guilty party. Yeah,
but no, like what they're worried about is getting tangled up in sort of this this battle to move to redirect the Aquifer funds. That's a more complicated ask, even though they haven't formed the ballot language or at least released the ballot language yet. They just find that, they think that that's going to, the divisiveness of the presidential election is going to spill over into that somehow. So they want basically sort of like a clean victory if they can get that.
I know Christian Archer, who ran the campaign for PreK for SA in 2012, and I don't think he's going to be involved this year, but he has made the point that you're gonna have a much bigger. I'm guessing you could. If you having it May versus November means maybe 1/5 as many voters as you would have in November. And so that means you're going to have a lot of people, as you said, turning out for the presidential race, for the U.S. Senate race. This PreK issue is going to be like near the bottom of the ballot. A lot of people are going to think, what's this? And I think it's a nerve-wracking thing when you're trying to get something passed when you've got a huge pool of voters and most of them don't know about the issue that you're trying, to get passed. Also, and this was talked a lot about a lot at last week's council meeting, it's a lot more expensive to run a November presidential election campaign when you're competing. Everybody else is running their political ads. You're trying to get some airtime. The rates are going to be a lot more expensive. In May, you kind of got the field to yourself.
It's kind of a recognition that PreK should be above all this other stuff, even because it should be independently supported.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And all this kind of reminds me of, there's sort of this kind of ongoing sort of murmur debate over whether they should move, council elections to even number of years to November, and just kind of how we kind of maintained sort of this fiction that the council races aren't partisan.
Yeah.
And anytime that gets brought up, people sort of balk and say, hey, no, keep it in odd number of years, because we don't want that sort of partisan rancor sort of getting into the council races.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think when Ron Nirenberg was a city council member, he talked a lot about voter engagement. I mean, this was something that I think he talked about a lot, throwing out at least the possibility of having council races in November of even numbered years. I mean, because it would make. I mean, we're looking at about 10%, 11% of turnout in municipal races, and the turnout would be huge. But
it would be more expensive for council members would have to, and candidates would have to raise a lot more money to run those elections just to cut through.
And what we've seen, I think, with judicial races, I mean, it's the same problem that I think we'd see with the municipal elections, and we would probably see with PreK if it was on the November ballot, which is in these judicial races. I mean, a lot of people just look at them and they think, who are these people? And they just kind of guess, or they look at party affiliation. And so, it becomes a real problem. But getting back to Representative Larson's letter and the big issue here really is that Via Metropolitan Transit is trying to get more funding, and trying to find some source, some way of getting sales tax funding over. I mean, they'd love to have a full cent, but to go from a half cent to a full cent, but really, realistically, now they're just trying to maybe get another 1/8 cent if they can. How likely is it that this is going to work out? That VIA is going to get at least some additional funding, which I think 1/8 is, we're looking at maybe $40 million.
Yeah, so it's about $40 million a year. And look, I don't have a clear sense of how this is going to go. This is 11 months out. But, I mean, this whole thing just hinges, I think, on whether SAWS takes on the Aquifer Protection program. That's a popular program, as we've said. And, being able for the mayor to sort of have that question answered kind of clears the runway a bit for
he's going to have
for
to
the
do
November
some
vote.
Persuasive analysis, and explanation for why SAWS would be adequate for the job.
Yeah, and again, I mean, if we look at these three issues, which is early education, aquifer protection, and public transit, I think the early education program, PreK, it's very likely it's going to pass, and they will continue. But I think the other two areas and how they're handled, I think will say a lot about Ron Nirenberg and where he goes from here, what his prospects are going to be in running for a third term next year. I mean, don't you think these are going to be really crucial issues?
I get the sense that he's staking a lot on the transportation issue, and he's made sort of the case. Look, like, we have rampant income inequality, entrenched poverty, and in the city. And one of his arguments against Lyle Larson saying, "Hey, go get it from PreK for SA," is, look, we have, we're not going to roll back something that we think is, making headway on solving some of these larger issues of poverty in the city. And that's kind of how he couches the public transit issue. And that's increasingly kind of what his sort of tenure is becoming about.
I think one of the things with PreK that is interesting is, I mean, a lot of people maybe who continue to have reservations about it or don't like it would say, one argument is, of course, this shouldn't be the realm of the city to get involved in education. But the second is, well, we're a city of 1.5 million people. This program provides early education for 2,000 kids at 4 centers in a city of 1.5 million. We're all paying taxes for a program that really serves a small group of kids. Mm-hmm. And I think what Dr. Beret has been effective at doing, and I noticed this at last week's council meeting, is that she makes the point that that's just really a small part of what we do. I mean, they're providing training for teachers. They're also providing grant funding for other education for schools and education centers. And so she's talking about it as like, this is a workforce program that's going to make people we're going to have a more educated community. We're going to have better teachers. We're going to be able we're actually helping the school system, the public school system, setting a model that they can then emulate. They're actually trying to partner. They're just beginning the process of trying to partner with schools in San Antonio to try to take that model and make it work there. So I think that's going to be, when we look at the advertising case that's going to be made for PreK for SA, it's going to be, not just that we got 4 centers with 2,000 kids, but that this is really trying to make San Antonio a more educated city.
I think it's also interesting that former House Speaker Joe Strauss, who of course was a Republican, he is on a committee, an early education steering committee that is advocating for the renewal of PreK for SA. So when you put that in contrast to Lyle Larson, who is also considered a more moderate Republican, right?
Right.
That it's somewhat surprising that perhaps that Larson would suggest that pre-K be rolled back.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that I'd kind of forgotten about until I was looking at this last week was that in 2012, in August of 2012, 3 months before PreK 4SA passed, Lyle Larson and Kevin Wolf, who was you know, the county commissioner, both Republicans, as you said, probably both would be considered like pragmatic Republicans. They jointly wrote then Mayor Julian Castro and sort of tried to talk him out of this PreK idea that he had. And I have not talked to Kevin Wolf in you know, about PreK 4SA in a long time, so I don't know where he stands on that. I know Lyle Larson. I think it became obvious last week. He still objects to the idea, but I don't know where Kevin.
I think Kevin will tell you exactly how he feels now because he's leaving office.
But you know, I mean, the fact that someone like Greg Brockhouse, for example, said, I was an opponent of it, and now I think it has merit to it. I mean, that says a lot. And you know, we've seen this at the federal level, you know, with Medicare, people were saying, you know, this is horrible and this is government overreach. And 2 or 3 years later, those same people were, you know, they didn't want to mess with it politically because it had become popular and people had gotten used to it. And so the challenge with PreK is, like I said, that only a small percentage of people in the city actually maybe have kids at those 4 education centers. Yeah. But if the argument is made well, I think it would be that this is actually affecting all of us in the city, even if your kid isn't in one of these centers.
Especially when you look at the numbers for how poverty is really getting worse here in San Antonio.
Absolutely.
And it's like every month it seems like there's just a new report about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're going to be following up on all these issues as the weeks go by. Thank you all for listening, and we'll catch up with you next week. Take care.